This is GARIS Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 375. Entitled Masculism and Global Warming. Description. This video discusses the impact of masculism on the phenomenon of global warming. One major solution to the global warming problem is to radically reduce the global population size. Masculist and MGTOW rejection of marriage and paternity may cause such a massive population decrease, but will men tolerate being screwed financially for several more decades by the gender politicians and instead assassinate them in a sex war, along with fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges, etc.? Once the population has reached a suggested 500 million, measures will have to be taken to ensure that the replacement rate of the birth rate is achieved. This flyer suggests how this might be done. Now the flyer itself. Masculism and Global Warming by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Masculism is going to have a profound impact on the global warming debate because it will cause billions of men to reject paternity until the gender laws are made men fair. Legislating the that's paternity rejection right, will probably take decades and will prove to be as vicious a fight as was the fight of the suffragettes for the female vote. In the meantime, as masculism spreads throughout the planet, millions of young men will have their masculist consciousnesses raised, becoming conscious of how badly traditional marriage and paternity suck for men. So they will reject marriage and paternity, which will cause the population to crash, which in turn will impact strongly on global warming and the global warming debate. The core notion of the Masculists is that men's lib, that is, the liberation of men, is largely about the liberation of men from being man-slaves to women, working for women, refusing to have relationships with traditional fluffies, that is, women who expect to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man. Fluffies are vermin to masculists, to be wiped out by being totally ignored by masculists and MGTOWs, that's men going their own way, who reject marriage, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves. Fluffies are not even pumped and dumped by these two men's liberation groups, thus forcing fluffy parasite genes to be removed from the gene pool. Masculism is the 21st century equivalent of 19th century North American abolitionism. The 19th century abolitionists saw Negro slavery as a moral abomination. The 21st century masculists see man-slavery as a moral abomination and aim to wipe it out by refusing to be man-slaves to fluffy parasites and to fluffy feminist hypocrites, in brackets, who hypocritically expect equal rights with men in the parliaments but behave as fluffy parasites in the divorce courts, treating men as cash machines to be robbed and abused by fluffy ex-wives. At the time of writing, 2020, in many advanced countries, the percentage of young men under 35 who refuse to marry and have kids is now about 70%. If the gender laws are not soon men-fared, that percentage will probably rise to over 90% a decade from now, so that within a mere generation the population size will have catastrophically collapsed. It is this population collapse that is so significant because it is largely caused by the masculist/MGTOW rejection of paternity, which in turn is caused by the fluffy feminist takeover of the divorce courts, making them so toxic for men that these fluffy feminist divorce court Judges and lawyers have become indirect genociders who have to be stopped with bullets if necessary. In a sex war, since no culture accepts passively its own annihilation without a fight. Masculine soldiers will not tolerate that the fluffy feminist genociders indirectly wipe out whole populations. These masculine soldiers will simply assassinate the gender politicians who have created these profoundly misandrous divorce laws that financially massacre one father in 4. They will murder the fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges, and even go out into the streets and simply shoot the feminazis who have the attitude that men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies, to whom fluffies have no loyalty, seeing men as having no genes in common with women, the baby creators, who use men as disposable resource providers to be robbed and abused. It may take several decades of masculinist agitation before this fluffy parasitic attitude of women is crushed out of them by overwhelming emotional rejection of them by masculists, forcing such women to rot on the shelf, utterly rejected by men, and increasingly as masculinist ideas spread across the planet, such women will be spat at, treated as vermin, as pariahs, to be socially rejected and reviled. Let us assume that the gender laws are not men-fared in 1 to 2 decades from now, and ask what impact that will have on the population size and in turn on the global warming phenomenon and debate. Let us assume that a decade from now, 90% of young men are rejecting paternity due to a widespread awareness of what the Masculists and MGTOWs are telling them on the internet, and hopefully via the journalists who will have finally latched onto the critical importance of what the Masculists are saying, in brackets. Since the MGTOWs are politically passive, they will make little contribution to educating the media people, close brackets. How long will it take for the gender politicians to become conscious that the major reason why the population is crashing is because of what the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites are doing to men in the divorce courts? That is, ripping men's kids from them with a 90% probability, giving his house to his fluffy ex-wife so she can raise her kids in it, forcing him to pay child support to his kids whom he will barely see, losing half his stuff to his fluffy ex-wife, paying alimony for life with no legal nor moral obligation on his fluffy ex-wife to get off her fat parasitic ass and fip up so that she continues to parasite off his money after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. Even the most misandrous feminazi bitch of a woman cannot fail to see that the massive injustices committed against men in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts. If such women don't care about such injustices happening to men, then that feminazi callousness towards men will only reinforce the hateful attitude of masculist soldiers to kill such women when and if the sex war comes. With 90% of young men in the advanced countries rejecting paternity, obviously the population will crash, and this may be a good thing in relation to the global warming problem, since global warming is ultimately a consequence of there being too many people on the earth, all producing carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas that is warming up the planet, causing the global warming phenomenon. Before proceeding further with the discussion of the impact of masculism on global warming, I need to place a strong question mark on whether hotter temperatures over the Earth is actually a net, in brackets, that is considering the costs versus the benefits, bad thing for the Earth and the Earth's human population. When one looks at the percentage of the Earth's total land surface area that is too cold to be habitable, for example, Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, northern Russia, northern Siberia, and the massive landmass miles under the Antarctic ice that has more than twice the surface area of Australia, then one cannot but wonder, quotes, if all this massive landmass becomes humanly habitable, then could its gains outweigh its losses? End quote. For example, imagine that the Northwest Passage becomes navigable by ships throughout the year, and that northern Russia and northern Canada become warmer and humanly habitable, then an enormous trade between the massive east-west continent of Eurasia and the massive north-south continent of the Americas could open up, generating enormous wealth for both northern regions. Have a look at a world atlas looking down at the Earth, looking down at the North Pole, and see how close the two massive continents are to each other. I call these newly thawed regions of the world the New World. It's not at all obvious to me that global warming is necessarily a net bad thing. Of course, if the ice caps melt and hence sea levels rise so that many coastal cities will be drowned, then that is obviously a disaster for the local populations. But over several centuries, once the new world opens up and is developed, is global warming then of necessity a bad thing? I have serious doubts about this question. But imagine that the politicians of the world decide that the global warming phenomenon has to be stopped, because in the shorter term, hundreds of millions of people are going to be severely economically and emotionally impacted as sea levels rise. Cities like New York, London, Amsterdam, etc., a long list, will be wiped out, drowned, destroyed, an absolute disaster. This is the end of part 1.